Hello again, AP US History students. Today I am going to lecture on the subject of World War II, the first of probably 3 lectures on this subject. Now, I am going to spend some time today talking about the Axis powers, what became the Axis, Italy, Germany, Japan, looking at their aggression. Strictly speaking, of course, that's world history, and any essay that you might be tasked with answering will not focus on them, but I think it's a fascinating story. I think it provides context, and I'm going to cover it. We will also, in today's lecture, be looking at developments in America in the 1930s, particularly around isolationism and neutrality. And yes, let's start. So, let's start with Italy. Italy was the first fascist regime to emerge in 1922, a full 11 years before Hitler took power in Germany. We often think of Mussolini and the Italian fascists as the junior partners in the European fascist regimes, certainly second to Hitler's and the Nazis. However, he predates Hitler and was successful far before Hitler was. So what was it that brought him to power? And the first thing that we can identify in this is that the Italian electoral system was highly democratic, but it did lead to a large plurality of parties. This was also problematic because Italy was quite a divided country, only unified in 1868. And as you can see from the diagram on the left, it was very hard to form a majority. Because of this, governments in Italy tended to be short-lived and unstable, and democracy really had a bad name in Italy by 1922. Secondly, after the demobilization following World War I, there was high unemployment, which led, of course, to much unhappiness in Italy. These are both factors. Other factors to consider were the fear of communism. Communism was very popular in Italy amongst the working classes. There was a tradition right through and up to World War II of support for communism. You can see it in many of the great soccer rivalries in Italy. In the capital of Italy, 2 soccer teams, Lazio, or the fascist team, Roma, the communist. In Milan, Inter Milan, the fascist, AC Milan, the communist. So where one was successful, the other eventually failed. But one helped the other. The fear of communism, the viability of communism as a possible system of government actually drove many into the arms of Mussolini. So who was this Mussolini? Benito Mussolini, something of a braggart, a real bluffer, a great propagandist. He was a journalist. He claimed to be a great war hero. In fact, he was shot in the ass in a training exercise during World War I. That didn't stop him. He used everything in his reach to take power. One of the fascinating aspects of World War I was that Italy essentially was bribed into joining World War I with the British in the Treaty of London. After the war, Italy had underperformed in the conflict, and the British and French and Americans saw no reason to stand by their promises, and Italy felt cheated out of the land that you can see in a dark shade in the middle picture. So these were significant reasons why Mussolini was able to take power in Italy. A lot of big talk from Mussolini during the 1920s, a lot of great promises. A lot of that, mixed success, we could say, wasn't really a threat on the world stage until Hitler came along. Now, let's talk about the Germans. Not going to spend long on the Treaty of Versailles. We've talked about this previously. You guys should know that Germany was hard done by at the end of World War I. We know about the reparations, the huge debt. We know about the war guilt clause. We know about the land that was taken from Germany. And so we know all this. However, a little less known is the fact that during the 1920s, that Germany did recover. There was an era during the Weimar Republic when Germany began to flourish. There were always those on the left, again, communists, but more so on the right, authoritarian conservative groups, not just the Nazis, other groups, who were looking to go back to the glory of the days of the German Empire. But Germany was doing well enough, and democracy seemed to be relatively now going on the way to being, entrenched in Germany. But then the Wall Street crash. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because Germany suffered massively when trade with America, when European trade collapsed. But more importantly, the German economic recovery of the 20s had been built on loans from America, loans that were recalled once the Wall Street crash occurred, once the run on the banks. So we're seeing here a more connected world by this stage. And with the collapse of the economy with high unemployment, people turned to extremes. Again, similar to Italy, because the communists, you can see the communists actually became very popular as well, and then stuck between a rock and a hard place. The people of Germany abandoned the democratic parties, moving to the left and the right, and many capitalists actually supported Hitler. Many companies, such as Krupp's, powerful companies, powerful capitalists, swung behind Hitler. They didn't like him. They looked down upon him as a radical, but they felt that he was at least someone that they could do business with. This extremist was someone that they could use. They could work to their own advantage. Of course, in the long term, that did not work out for anybody, least of all the Germans. Now, what would be the characteristics of the fascists, more particularly, what are the characteristics of the Nazi regime? Well, one of the major aspects is the idea of ultranationalism. That is a form of patriotism, a form of nationalism that goes beyond a healthy respect for one's nation. It goes way over into intolerance, the idea, of course, of a super people, a master race. And of course, where there's a master race, there are those who are lesser. And we do know the Nazis taught that of the Jews. That is very well known. But bear in mind, too, that they looked down particularly upon Africans, African Americans, and the Slavs. Don't forget about the Slavs. They looked down hugely upon the people of the East, of the Poles, of the Czechs. They particularly hated the Russians because not only were the Russians Slavic peoples, they were communists. And bear in mind that the Nazis hated the communists. Another significant aspect of the Nazis was that they were totalitarian. This is the belief that the individual was unimportant and it was all about the motherland, and that really people existed to glorify the nation, and that the nation was of all importance, and that the people that they should really, all aspects of their lives could come to be controlled by the state. That is, from the music they listened to the books they read, to the schooling they got. And of course, all of this would come under the tutelage, the governorship of one all-powerful leader, their Führer, Adolf Hitler. Where to start with Hitler? There's so much one can say about him. He really is a fascinating character, horrible person, but really nonetheless fascinating. And there are many misconceptions about Hitler. One of them being, of course, that he was some sort of mad genius. Hitler wasn't a genius. He had certain talents, the great gift for propaganda, a gift for speaking of a certain kind, a very violent speaker. He was very shouty in his style. He could manipulate people. He played people off against each other. But he was no genius. Yes, he did help rebuild the economy of Germany, but we will see when it came around to World War II that he actually really undermined the German war effort. the quite brilliantly led German war machine, led by very talented generals. But he undermined that. But anyway, enough of that. Let's talk now about the third, well, no, actually a couple of other things. Hitler, so why was he cause for concern for the big powers? Why was he cause for concern? Because, of course, he was trying to undo the Treaty of Versailles. We see here on the left, he was trying to gain land, demilitarize the Rhineland. The Anschluss, unifying Germany with Austria. Then taking back the Sudetenland, the periphery of Czechoslovakia that was considered to be quite Germanic, which eventually led to the total overthrow and conquest of Czechoslovakia. Now, one of the most terrible events to occur in these years before the war itself, before World War II, was the Civil War in Spain. This is covered in the video. We have here the Republican, the democratically elected government of Spain, supported by the socialists and also strategically by the communists, up against the forces of the right, the fascists, who were supported by the church, by conservative powers, and this war raged in 1936. It raged onwards past this. The democratic powers stood idly by. Germany, France, the United States, the major democratic powers did not help the Republican government in Spain. Fascist Italy, fascist Germany, that is Nazi Germany, did intervene, bringing victory to Franco and the Spanish fascists. So we have a series of victories for Hitler in these years. Why then did the British and French follow a policy of appeasement? Why did they do it? And you know, there is a tendency here to go very, very harsh on Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. And of course, where Chamberlain is the fall guy, enter stage left, the great hero, Winston Churchill. I think a lot of this is overdone. Churchill had many unpleasant characteristics. So I wouldn't get too carried away with that. Yes, he had a talent for oration. Yes, he had a great turn of phrase. Yes, he did see Hitler for what he truly was. But we must remember that the British and French policy of appeasement, a policy which was followed by the United States to a large degree, was widely popular. This quote from Chamberlain sums it up. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Think about this generation of leaders. Who are these people? Typically 50, 60-year-olds, men and women. These were the leaders. They had witnessed the carnage of the First World War. What do we know about the First World War? Well, it was a terrible, useless war. It really was. It wasn't like the Second World War where there was terrible, evil powers that had to be fought. No, it wasn't. It was a useless war. And there was this terrible sense that this was all happening again. And this generation of leaders did not want to send their sons, literally their sons, to the slaughter, like they had lost their brothers and so forth. So we tend to go too harsh, in my opinion, on the appeasers. Yes, they were wrong, but boy, it was understandable. Now, where did the communists figure into this? Where did the communists figure into this? We're not going to get into this too much detail. Again, absolutely extraordinary story, fascinating story. A unique character in Stalin who replaced Lenin. Speaking of Lenin, Churchill once said of Lenin that Russia's greatest tragedy was Lenin's birth. Their second greatest tragedy was Lenin's death. Disagree with that a little bit on the first, a bit harsh, but the point being here was that when Lenin died, Stalin took over. Stalin was really quite psychopathic. He was paranoid to the sense of being sickly. He felt that those around him were out to get him. One of the great victims of Stalin were fellow communists who dared question his methods. And why is all of this relevant? Well, it's relevant because during the 1930s, Stalin, of course, controlled the media in Russia, but people outside of Russia knew the terrible things that were going on, the show trials and so forth. And Hitler used this to disguise what he was doing. Hitler argued that he was the bulwark, the defender against communism, that the democratic power shouldn't worry about him Hitler because he would be the savior of the free world. People bought it. People ignored Hitler. They put up with his advances because they thought he was that Stalin was the great danger, not Hitler. And thus the tragedy was all lying in wait. Now, the Japanese, in your post this week in relation to our anticipation question, and many of you were fascinated by the Japanese angle of the story, saying how neglected it was. Many of you asking, why was it that the Japanese were so aggressive in these years? So what motivated them? Well, there were many different motivations, but the great single motivation for the Japanese for this era of expansion, of aggressive expansion, was that there was a thought process in Japan that in order to survive, in order not to be colonized, as so many other non-European peoples of the world had been, that Japan simply had to expand and conquer other territories in order to survive. They had to become a great power in order to survive. Why did they have to go beyond Japan to do this? Because Japan, for all its qualities, lacked natural resources, lacked oil, lacked steel, lacked coal. So they felt they had to go and take this. What they did have was a disciplined, highly unified culture. They had a warrior tradition, and they used this to devastating effect in the countries of Asia. We see here China was at its lowest point in all of its great history. After Korea was attacked and conquered by the Koreans, the Japanese attacked and took large parts of China. China, meanwhile, was just riven by a civil war between the nationalists and the communists, which of course allowed the Japanese to come in. And we see then also invading down into Indochina, into Vietnam, and that leads to a story for another day. Okay, so now let's have a few words about isolation in America. Why was it a popular policy? Very simply, a lot of the same reasons. Look at this on the left. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. That's straightforward for you. People wanted to avoid war. Also, of course, distracted by the Great Depression. There was a sense here that America had much bigger problems. They couldn't worry. They weren't in a position to fight for people in other countries when they were suffering so much at home. Now, America First. This is a famous political pressure group for neutrality. Their most famous advocate was here Charles Lindbergh. He, the tragic Lindbergh, whose baby was kidnapped and murdered, the iconic, heroic Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. He and others really genuinely were afraid of being dragged into the war. There's a genuine desire there to avoid war. However, there is also a nasty underbelly of anti-Semitism prevalent in America First amongst many of these isolationists. How far did this extend? Well, and many of you might be quite shocked to learn that anti-Semitism was prevalent amongst some of America's most famous figures. Here are two on the right. Walt Disney, I know, Walt Disney, he, the beloved, lovable cartoon creator, was just one of many people who was on the record for their anti-Semitic statements. Even more anti-Semitic was Henry Ford, the creator of the first great American car company, Irish-American, Henry Ford. Rather not say he was anti-Semitic, but he was. He was. So, then though, thankfully, there are some people we can look back upon now with fondness and say they saw it coming. Like Churchill in Europe, people who said no during the 30s. And here we have it, an unlikely hero. Dr. Seuss, yes, at least one of your childhood heroes here stands out well. Oh, I love this cartoon on the right. How brilliant, how absolutely devastating this cartoon is. Cutting. Here we have it. Look at, check it out for yourself. Fantastic. Now, the defenders of isolation did, though, appear to have prevailed, even enshrining their position in law. So what did the Neutrality Acts involve? There was a series of them, 4 Neutrality Acts passed by Congress. and signed by FDR into law in the mid to late 1930s. What did they entail? Well, quite a lot, in fact. First of all, we have to say that yes, these guys are on the wrong side of history, but that some of their ideas were understandable. First of all, they wanted to avoid much of the war profiteering that had gone on during World War One. They didn't want to be dragged into a war by corporations. So they stated that no American company was allowed to sell arms to a belligerent in a war. Secondly, American ships would not be allowed into the waters of a belligerent that was at war, that Americans would not be allowed on the ships of belligerent powers. Really extensive. So FDR, what was his position on these neutrality acts? Well, in private, FDR did not agree with them. He opposed them, he complained about them in the mid-1930s, and as the decade grew on, he grew more concerned about them. So why did he sign them into law then? Well, FDR was a great politician, and as a politician, he made compromises. Just as he made compromises on the rights of African Americans, he made compromises on neutrality. He had a certain amount, all politicians have a certain amount of political capital that they can spend. He did not want to spend it on this, he did not want to die in this hill, so to speak. And so FDR essentially put his reservations aside for a while in order to get his New Deal acts supported and passed through Congress, which is what happened. But when World War II did break out in 1939, he began to move the country towards a position, a preparedness, a readiness for war. And that is a story that we will continue in the next lecture. Please look out for a Google form quiz I'm going to put up on this and some associated readings today. I want to mix it up. Thank you for all your contribution to the classroom questions, but I'd like to mix it up now and do something else. Also today, there should be a big announcement from AP with a more definitive ruling on what indeed will be the format of your AP exam. Thank you, guys.